I'm Sean O'Brien, President and CEO of NatureServe, with this month's episode of Conservation Conversations, where I had the great pleasure of talking with James Evans, who's the Executive Director of Companions and Animals for Reform and Equity, also known as CARE. James is going to talk a little bit about that organization. James is also a wildlife photographer who has a new book out called Among the Birds, I Am Human. And James and I talk a lot about that in the upcoming podcast. This podcast is a little different from many that you've heard from us at Conservation Conversations. It's less about the diversity of nature and more about the diversity of humanity. James's work focuses on the BIPOC community, which is Black, Indigenous, and people of color, and their relationships with animals and nature. And we talk a lot about what that means for him personally and for people of color in general in wild spaces and in society. And we hope that you will enjoy this show and think about the role of people with different backgrounds and different perspectives in nature and in the conservation of nature and protecting our planet for the future. Also, before we start today, I want to ask that if you love listening to this podcast, that you will consider making a donation to NatureServe to protect North American biodiversity. Donating online is easier than ever, and you can do it quickly from your phone or from our website. Just visit natureserve.org and click donate. And thank you for your support. I understand you're a Baltimore native. Is that right?
I am a Baltimore native. I was born in Baltimore. Let me see, 1968. So just a little bit ago.
2 years after I was born, not in Baltimore, but my family's from Baltimore.
Oh, is it?
Yeah, my dad's family has been in Baltimore since the late 1800s.
Wow.
So what I'm curious about is you grew up in a pretty urban setting, Baltimore. And I'm curious about your early life and your early exposure to wildlife and to nature, and what inspired you to sort of be interested in sort of the care of the planet and the care of animals.
Yeah. That's a good question. I grew up in a very urban setting, there's an enormous amount of concrete. Like when you think about it, it just seems so unnatural. Mm-hmm. And there is an enormous park in the middle of Baltimore, Druid Hill Park. And we lived maybe 14 or 15 blocks away. And that was the only space where I think my mom felt comfortable letting us just, she called it ripping and running. And we walked to the park and back. And so that was the greenest space that I was exposed to. But I didn't think of it as a wildlife space the way I think of it now. Mm-hmm. But the thing that turned me on early was Mutual of Omaha.
Me too.
I had my favorite shows, The $6 Million Man, Wonder Woman, and all of those shows back then. The Mutual of Omaha was just a Sunday staple, and followed by my next favorite show, which was 60 Minutes. I mean, I would get as close to the television as I could possibly get. And I think, the contrast between growing up in a city where it's loud, you don't see wild animals. I did not see squirrels in my neighborhood at all. No squirrels or anything like that. It was, dogs, cats, rats, and that was the extent of, wildlife. So yeah, Mutual of Omaha was. I may as well have been watching a show about another planet.
Yeah. So I often credit Mutual of Omaha and National Geographic and Jacques Cousteau, because I'm basically the same age as you are, with sort of forming my interest in thinking about and working to conserve nature and conserve biodiversity. So it's interesting to hear you say that those had an influence on you, because
huge.
It shows the power of media, of course.
Yes, and it's so. I mean, the power of media in so many ways, it's incredible, and that's the business that I'm in now. I've spent a lot of time in mass communications, is what mass comms for short, and I think people take for granted how important it is to frame messages properly, which also means including people in those messages, diverse people across the planet. And watching Mutual of Omaha, I love Jacques Cousteau, by the way. And when I started taking French in high school, I realized that his name was James. And I was like, oh, this guy is like super cool now. But yeah, I mean, when I was a kid, I had no concept of the lack of diversity, but I also had no ambitions to be in those same spaces. I never imagined myself as being Jacques Cousteau or being on Mutual of Omaha. And I think that's directly connected to having not seen anyone like myself in those spaces. And so it was years. And I mean, it's only been, I would say, 10 years since I imagined myself as a wildlife photographer, as someone that's invested in the environment. So often those voices are non-brown voices.
Right. So there's so many things I want to follow up on, but I want to give you a chance to tell us about your organization that you founded and run and what its goals are, because it has several roles related to the things we've just been talking about with diversity and with animals and exposure, and of course, diverse voices in this landscape. So tell us a little bit about your organization.
Thank you. So in brief, I ran a mass communications firm for years, and a few of our major clients were the Humane Society of the United States and Best Friends and all of the sort of larger animal welfare organizations. And in doing that work, so often these folks would be very interested in advertising or getting predominantly BIPOC neighborhoods or communities interested in spay neuter. But the net is, I noticed early on in doing that work for our clients that while they were trying to reach out to BIPOC communities, there were no BIPOC members inside of their own firms. And so we were being used as a liaison between this very white animal protection world and BIPOC communities.
And just quickly, because one of the things I like to do on this podcast
is define BIPOC.
Is not leave acronyms unspoken.
Yep.
So Black, Indigenous, and people of color, correct?
Yep, exactly. Yeah. Okay. And so having not seen that, at that point in my life, I was a business person. And so my talents were around mass communications. And so we did the work. We sort of insisted on including people of color in their magazines, in commercials, and in the literature. And so we were able to do that, but no more than that. It was all surface level. Mm-hmm. And one of our major donors, our first donor, Spring Point, they're located in Philadelphia. Chathan Amero of Spring Point essentially started looking around the industry and asking if there's someone that is BIPOC in the industry that is willing to champion or start an organization around bringing more BIPOCs to the field. She found me, we had a long conversation, and she asked if I would be willing to start a not-for-profit. And I said yes, like a crazy person.
I was going to say, this was a pretty big shift in your life.
It was a really, really, really big shift. But I think so often, asking people to do the work that they're already doing and saying, by the way, I see you, I recognize you, I recognize your gifts, I recognize you're the only person in this field who is willing to branch out and be intentionally inclusive. So, while it seemed very different, it really was what we were already doing. We were trying to do the work that animal welfare organizations were asking us to do. We were just asking them to be a little bit more inclusive, and for the most part, to no real avail.
Mm-hmm.
Nevertheless, we started CARE in 2019, and CARE stands for Companions and Animals for Reform and Equity. Mm-hmm. And shortly after starting CARE, George Floyd was murdered. And so it's an enormous amount of attention inside of the animal protection field turned towards CARE to start answering somewhat obvious questions, right? Which is, I think many organizations and individuals around the country started asking themselves questions. One of the essential, or maybe more guarded questions was, am I racist? Right? Did I see this coming? Right? Or why didn't I see this coming? I think we often ask ourselves that as adults, because watching something like that on television and understanding it has deep social consequences, all of which are avoidable. And so inside of animal welfare, folks were asking those questions at the same time CARE was launching itself. So I think I was on, I think probably 10 podcasts a month or engagements a month. And this was also at the beginning of COVID. So it gave us a great platform. People were stuck at home. And so the principle around CARE, by the way, is it is not a DEI effort, right? People get confused because we are mostly people of color running the organization, but our work is really centralized around doing the same work our white counterparts were doing. We're just addressing it from a perspective based in community wisdom, based in our own lived experience, and in some ways we're doing the work inside of a protected space that many of us didn't have when we were working for predominantly white organizations.
So how do you see, because you're coming from a different perspective and you have many people of color in your organization, and your team is really impressive, of course, on your website, you got a great group of people working with you.
Amazing.
How do you see your approach to these issues being different from the predominantly white-run organizations that are working in this field?
That's a really good question. I don't have all the answers for why this is, but I think part of it is rooted in a sense of it is. I deeply believe it's rooted in white supremacy, and I think often when people think of white supremacy, they think of it as someone being lynched, right? Or this hyper violentness. But that's the extreme end of white supremacy. The more passive end of white supremacy is the reason that whiteness exists anyway. It's to dominate, right? It was designed to dominate, and in that there is my mom used to say, white makes right. Right. That is often the perspective of white dominant culture, is that from our white dominant space, we already know the answers. So a lot of NGOs, non-for-profits, they enter into spaces to solve problems, but they don't do any deep listening with the groups for which they're trying to solve problems. Right. So, for instance, you have groups that will come in to an indigenous community like the one I'm in right now, and attempt to shame them or blame them for the large amount of free roaming dogs and cats. Mm-hmm. But that community has a deep interest in seeing those animals free. right? They don't see dogs and cats roaming um, any differently than deer roaming or fox roaming or hawks roaming, right? We were joking the other day. I said, people feed outdoor birds all the time. And if that bird crashes into a window, no one says, "Oh, you're an irresponsible bird owner," right? How did you allow your bird to run into a window? Um, but that's what happens here. The more dominant white side of animal welfare is also often shaming indigenous communities for allowing their animals to roam free. But and then in doing so, they project this misconception on the community that they don't actually care about the animals. But indigenous people are spiritually tied to animals in ways that white communities don't identify with. So many of the folks that we are working with, they belong to clans. I mean, they have eagle clans and bear clans and otter clans. And so they're intrinsically, everything about what they do connects them to animals. And just because they don't want to see them fenced doesn't mean they don't care. They care in a different way than we care. And so when you come into a community like this and you attempt to solve problems by doing things that encourage tethering or fencing without talking to folks, then you're trying to solve your problem. You're not trying to solve the community's problem.
Right.
And so white dominant culture often doesn't listen to community. And so one of the things that CARE does is, regardless of what community that we're in, whether it's indigenous or it's Philadelphia or it's Atlanta, we start first with asking people how they want to solve their own problems. And we also finance and mentor those groups to start their own non-for-profits to solve their problems themselves. And that is really unique in that so often to increase inclusion in organizations, you have DEI practitioners and they come into large white dominant spaces, many of them white themselves, and they try to encourage the leadership to allow BIPOCs, Black, Indigenous, and people of color into that space. And what we're doing is saying, yes, definitely realize that there is untapped genius. But on the other hand, what we're doing is we are going to those BIPOC folks themselves in their own communities and saying, you don't need to join this white dominant group. What you need to do is solve your own problems at your own pace, in your own way, using your own community wisdom.
Yeah,
so it really sets us apart.
The word that you said there that sort of made my heart skip was allow them in.
That is correct.
As though people should need permission to come into any space. But of course, we know, institutional racism and things. And of course, right now we're talking a lot. You mentioned the words earlier, or the letters DEI before. We talk about diversity, equity, inclusion, and also B for belonging. And of course, if you belong, then you don't need to be allowed in.
That is correct.
You're in.
That is correct.
That's one of the challenges. And I'm reflecting back to what you said at the very, very beginning of our conversation about how you didn't see yourself as a wildlife photographer because you didn't see anybody who looked like you. And so you didn't feel like you maybe were allowed in or you belonged. And you also said a little while ago, I see you, as in like, I see you for who you are. And that makes me want to go back to a conversation that we were having before. We were on being recorded, but I want us to revisit. And that is related to your book, which has the title, Among the Birds, I Am Human. And so in this book, you have just gorgeous photography, by the way. So people should definitely check it out. We talked before about that one photograph of the two birds, just mind blowing. But I also want to talk about what that title means to you and how that is part of your journey from I didn't see anybody who looks like me to a place where you are right now, where you're in an indigenous community in the Midwest talking about, the care of animals. Talk a little bit about your book and why you called it Among the Birds, I Am Human, and what that means to you.
Yeah. One, this is the first time I've produced the book, so it gives me the tingles hearing somebody repeat the title. It sounds so odd in a good way. But I think for me, and this has taken years to find the vocabulary for that title. I just want to be treated like a stranger, like an individual, and that's what happens when you're out amongst any kind of wildlife. Wildlife doesn't see you as a tall, athletic white guy, or a short guy, or a Black man, or an Asian woman, right? Wildlife just sees you as human. You are a human being, and somehow over the millennia, I suspect our behavior has always been somewhat less than good. And it seems that every species on the planet knows that. And so our silhouette, I think, signals fear for most animals. And I'm okay with that, because that fear is not connected to something that is racialized, right? That fear is something that's connected to the whole of humanity. We have a tendency to be wasteful. We have a tendency to be violent for no reason. And we have a tendency to be very, very unproductive in a way that's different than animals. Mm-hmm. And I understand their initial fear of us, but I don't understand other people's initial fear of me, beyond being racialized, beyond being criminalized. Being Black is often equated, whether we recognize it immediately or not, with being criminalized. And so for me, I'm allowed to be my whole self inside of a natural setting, because animals don't look at me the way white Americans look at me. And to be honest, the animals don't look at me the way Black Americans look at me. I've been in many situations where my interest in science, or my interest in art or photography, has triggered other people to call me white. You're acting white. You're being white, because they associate those sensitivities or curiosities with purely whiteness, because they've not been exposed to those things before, so they think they only exist in a white existence. So right. It's but again, I feel often the most like my natural self inside of natural settings.
Yeah, I mean, you surely experienced the situations that happened in Central Park, and the things that Drew Lanham talks about being a black birder, and how the Black man with binoculars is suspicious.
My wife is so concerned about me being out by myself, and I just think that that's sad.
Very sad.
And, I have had people say some pretty threatening things, mostly things that hurt my feelings or agitate me. And I don't typically feel like my life is in danger, except when law enforcement is around, because I'm in camo. I shoot at often at Conowingo Dam. And since September 11th, Conowingo Dam is a protected area. You can't really get close to the dam like you used to be able to. And the eagles are always near the dam. Mm-hmm. And so once I was there in camo, like everyone else, by the way, it's like, I think it's 22 degrees out. Everyone's in camo. Everyone has on face gear to keep their noses from freezing off. But this one woman walks up to me and she asked me, if I was a terrorist. And there was law enforcement on the parking lot.
Mm-hmm.
And then there's some law enforcement from the Department of Natural Resources. And immediately when she said that, I thought, of a number of nasty comments. But then I thought, these are milliseconds, by the way, that I can't make her mad. I don't have the latitude to make her mad, because if she had the nerve to say that to me and then I make her mad, what if she says something to these law enforcement officers who are now approaching me because a white woman is approaching them and she's afraid that I might be a terrorist. So now they're walking up to me as if that narrative is already true. Uh-huh. Now my camera is not a camera. Now there might be something in my gloves. It's not fair that I have to absorb that level of stress just to take pictures of eagles. It could not be more benign.
Right. Taking pictures of bald eagles, right? What could be more American?
What could be more American, right? Exactly. All right.
These stories are important to hear, but also, from my perspective, who's never experienced that kind of treatment, just sort of terrifying. And so one of the challenges, of course, that we're facing, and one of the reasons that you have CARE as your organization, is to try and empower BIPOC people to feel more comfortable in these kinds of spaces, but also to give you a space to talk. But we have a huge societal problem, and something like 13% of the U.S. population is Black, and maybe 6% of science, technology, and engineering professionals are Black. That's a pretty big discrepancy, and when you throw in other people of color, I'm sure the difference becomes even greater. What can we do? I mean, you're making spaces that will allow people to see people who look like them in these kinds of fields. Right. Is this a really slow breaking wave, or can we sort of encourage this wave to form and crest more quickly? What can we do?
Wow, that's a great question. I think the one thing we can do, and it may seem subtle, is to language is important, and I will say, for instance, the term empower, which has got its own sort of inertia going, right? For me, BIPOC people of color, indigenous people are incredibly powerful and ingenious and creative already. We don't need to bestow that on anyone. If you believe in a divine being, that divine being or that universal spirit or that stardust, I think that got evenly sprinkled on all of us, right? So when you see a group that is living under the statistics that Brown and Black people are often living under, low unemployment, high mortality rates from COVID, anything socially measurable. When you see that group of people constantly living at the margins, right? We have to accept that we have done something wrong. There's something wrong with the entire structure, because if the stardust was, spread evenly, how is it that this one group that happens to call itself white has all the advantages that these other groups don't have? Right. So the system is broken, and the only way to dismantle the system is for people to step out of it and stop thinking that all I need to do is vote for the right mayor. All I have to do is vote for the right senator. All I have to do is vote for the right governor. and everything is going to fall into place. That's nonsense, because that allows us to ignore one another in public spaces, right? When I'm in a public space, it's not a governor or president that's assaulting me, right? A governor didn't assault Mr. Cooper in Central Park. That's a single woman that has decided that Chris Cooper was the equivalent of a criminal. That was a decision that she made. And so for that press that you're talking about to happen, we have to start making better individual decisions.
I like this idea that you talk about with nature, seeing basically all humans the same, because one of the things that we really want people to do is to go out into nature. And
Right.
we're routinely asking scientists to go out into nature and experience plants and animals and wildlife in different ways. And hopefully, we can encourage and be part of the solution and making and helping people see people that are like them in this field, because many of the things that you've said earlier about, for instance, the way indigenous people view animals and wildlife, whether they're pets or wild animals, is a perspective on animals that I don't think about. It's not part of my history. It's not part of my culture that I grew up with. But it's really interesting to think about, and to think about what kind of messaging we send. The really silly example is many people in my neighborhood let their house cats go outside. And those house cats, I have seen them catch birds and chipmunks and things in my yard, and it's very frustrating.
Yes.
Now, this is a suburban neighborhood outside of Washington, as opposed to, a more rural setting where maybe animals outside is a different thing. But my thought is, house cats belong inside. And when you were talking earlier, I was like, oh, well, yeah, maybe in some places they do, but not everywhere. And so it changed, you changed my thinking during our conversation. I really appreciate that. I think it's really beneficial to have our preconceived notions challenged.
And believe me, my preconceived notions are challenged all the time, but I think that's the decision that I've made to let that happen. But I think I've come to the conclusion that it's not that cats belong inside, it's that we belong outside. People belong outside. I think that's the mistake that we've made. We've made this crucial error in our development that we're no longer going to be migratory, right? Mm-hmm. We're going to own parts of the planet. And once we own it, we're going to build on it. We're going to build tall. We're going to build big. We're going to make ourselves comfortable. We're going to create air-conditioned places and make ourselves nice and cozy. And all we've done is cut ourselves off from this natural world, the natural ebb and flow. Mm-hmm. So it's an interesting thing to me in thinking about indigenous folks and whether or not their animals should be roaming. I think we are the ones that are supposed to be roaming.
So, James, I want to ask you one last thing, and you can either answer both questions or one or the other. But it's sort of one thing. Enough. So it's essentially, earlier you talked about Isabel Wilkerson and the warmth of other suns as sort of she has an inspiring quote. So I'm interested in someone who has inspired you and maybe inspired you to come to the path you're on now. You talked about someone earlier who essentially talked you into starting a nonprofit, but maybe there's a more meta type person. But then also was thinking about if there's someone or some book or something that you would recommend to the listeners to help them open their minds to the kinds of things that you care about.
Wow. It wouldn't be one book. It would definitely be Warmth of Other Suns, but also Cass by the same author, Isabel Wilkerson. Warmth of Other Suns came first, and it really talks about the Great Migration, Black Americans moving to the North and to the West, mostly. Incredible book. Caste is a more universal book that talks about the caste system itself, which Isabel hypothesized that false caste is bigger than race. And you have to read the book to get it, but it's an incredible book. So those two books on the sort of like social justice, what is race, what is racism, what is caste, those two books. But when I think about where we are as humans and how we've lost our way, I think about The Good Earth, because it speaks so much to the corruptive nature of greed, and this man who was essentially, I guess, considered a poor Asian farmer. He actually had everything when he was just farming, when he was connected to the land. And then when he leveraged that farming into material wealth, it was completely corrosive to his body, his mind, and to his well-being. And I think that's where we are now. We have, and
that's The Good Earth by Pearl S. Buck, right?
That's Pearl S. Buck, yeah. And to me, that's slavery, right? We took the land, we sold the land, we sold the tobacco, we sold the cotton for all this material wealth, and all it's done is corrupted us. And this land, as it was by itself, indigenous people literally had everything.
Well, James, this has been really, really interesting, and we could keep talking, but I also want to respect your time and respect the time of all of our listeners, because we're going to, I think, give them a different thing this month than that they've had in the past, and hopefully give them a lot to think about, especially because many of our listeners are people who are out in the wild and they're bird watching, and hopefully they will have some new things to think about when they see BIPOC people out birding, and treat them as strangers and have a better reaction to them.
Yeah, treat them as strangers and also protect them. You know, that woman that called me a terrorist, another man that became a friend walked over to her and said, he is absolutely not a terrorist. He's a birder. And, you know, he made that decision. Again, it's a personal decision to step in and correct something that he knew that I think he intuitively knew that I couldn't correct.
Right.
So I think those are the things that are going to make that crest and that wave a little bigger and stronger and faster.
Awesome. Well, thanks so much. And thanks for the great work you do. We'll have links to your website and everything in the description for the show, but it's careawo.org if people are looking for you online. And also on the website, right, they can see a PDF of at least parts of the book and some of your beautiful wildlife photography, which I highly encourage people to do. There's some amazing shots in there. And thank you, James, for all that you do. It's really awesome that you're out there and doing that. Thank you.
Awesome. Thank you so much. I appreciate being on the show. It was really lovely.
I hope you found that episode as interesting as I did. I really enjoyed my conversation with James, and I want to thank you for listening to this episode of Conservation Conversations. The podcast really is an incredible opportunity for me to talk with scientific experts about the methods and philosophies behind biodiversity conservation, and of course, other topics, as we just did. But there's another group of people who drive our work forward, and that's supporters like you who make contributions to NatureServe. As a nonprofit, we rely on donations to continue the work of providing the best scientific information for effective conservation decision-making. This giving season, please consider making a donation to NatureServe to protect North American biodiversity. I encourage you to visit our website at natureserve.org to see the many ways that you can give and find one that's right for you. My favorite is adopt a species, but you may have a different way that you want to support us. Every donation counts, and we really appreciate your support. It makes a huge difference. Have a great holiday season, and please don't forget to join us in December for the last episode of Conservation Conversations for 2022.